waiting for you before. A couple of things. This is the this stuff, whatever you call that stuff, right here.
PowerPoint slide.
Thank you. And that's what this is, so that you can follow along. Last time we sat here and I couldn't read anything, so I said, I want this. I also have them for the first and second session, and there's an email if you want to get the for 1 and 2, and I'll be doing it for 4 and 5. So leave your email address and I'll get that stuff to you. And I think that's, and if you have, these are sitting over here if you want one of these.
Oh,
This is August here, not this. And that. Oh, then you have to read that. Okay, enjoy. You will.
Okay, good evening, folks. I'm Tom Peet. It's very nice to meet you. I'm getting a little bit of feedback on the laptop here as it's circling around, so I'm not sure if we can get rid of that technical problem, but welcome to part 3 of Subject to Citizen, Why the Constitution Still Matters. And let me do a quick review of part 2 at the very end. The Second Continental Congress had written the Articles of Confederation. That was passed on September the 15th, 1777. And it wouldn't be until 1781 that the last state, Maryland, ratified the Articles of Confederation and they went into effect. Unfortunately, the Articles of Confederation were fatally flawed. And the flaws included no ability to tax, no ability to regulate trade between the states or between foreign nations, which was critical. They had no executive, no head of state. The president of Continental Congress was technically the president of the United States, but without any executive authority, hardly whatsoever. There was no national judiciary, so there was no way to resolve differences between these 13 independent nations for all practical purposes. Each state had 1 vote in Continental Congress, regardless of its size. So the big states were Massachusetts, Virginia, New York, and all the rest were much smaller states. And the large states with large populations at that time resented the fact that the small states had the same 1 vote in spite of the fact that the large states were much larger. That was not easily resolved. Passing laws required the approval of 9 of the 13 states, or 69%, greater than 2/3. To amend the Articles of Confederation required the unanimous approval of all 13 states, and that never happened on anything ever. Which is not to say that some very important legislation that I mentioned in the last meeting, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, was a critical piece of legislation in how new states were going to be added to the United States of America. There's a serious question. Did the new states have all the rights that the old states had? And there was a pretty serious argument. And basically the Second Continental Congress had said, yes, new states will have all the rights and all the responsibilities of the original 13 states. There would be no difference in how they were treated. And then with that, in the 1780s, 1782, 83, 84, there was a serious economic downturn. The serious economic downturn was related to the inability to regulate trade between the states or between foreign nations, and the lack of a standard American bank, a federal bank of some sort. Each state had its own currency. Each state also used Spanish doubloon. They used whatever they had, but specie, which is metal, hard metal, silver, gold, copper coins, was in very, very short supply. The economic downturn of the mid-1780s has been compared to the Great Depression of 1929. It was serious. Now, each of the states was trying to figure its way out of this situation. And we also had one last thing. Because the government of the United States could not tell the states, the Second Continental Congress or the Continental Congress under Articles, could not tell the states what to do. The states were not honoring the agreements with Great Britain that they had made in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Because of that, Britain cut off all trade with the United States, even though effectively the colonies were their greatest trading partner. So it had it was a double-edged sword. It hurt both Britain and it particularly hurt the colonies. And because the colonies were not living up to the agreements as far as honoring the claims of the loyalists, those who had had their slaves taken away from them and resented it, or their property taken away from and resented it. The individual 13 states were like Alfred E. Newman. What? Be worried? They would not honor any of their requests. So Britain kept these ports. Britain occupied American territory until 1795. Fort Ophir on Lake Champlain, Port Dutchman's Point, Lake Champlain, Fort Mackinac, Mackinac Island, Michigan, Fort Miami, Miami River, Ohio, Fort Niagara, Niagara River, Youngstown, New York, Fort Ontario / Fort Oswego, Lake Ontario, Oswego, New York, and Fort Oswegatchie on the St. Lawrence River and near Ogdensburg, New York. So those troops were on American territory till 1795. Stop and think about that. So people recognized that there was a situation. George Washington in particular wrote to Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Harrison, yes, the great-great-grandfather of Benjamin Harrison, the president, and I think the grandfather to William Henry Harrison, president. The disinclination of the individual states to yield competent powers to Congress for the federal government, their unreasonable jealousy of that body and of one another, the disposition which seems to pervade each of being all wise and all powerful within itself will, if there's not a change in the system, be our downfall as a nation. This is as clear to me as A, B, and C. I think we have opposed Great Britain and have arrived at the present state of peace and independency to very little purpose. If we cannot conquer our own prejudices. So the Maryland and Virginia, both their legislatures decided that they wanted to resolve a long-standing issue of navigation of the Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay was Maryland taxed every Virginia ship that went. So Virginia then taxed, it had a reciprocal tax. It was basically almost open warfare. Washington knew that was bad. Both legislatures created a conference that was supposed to be at Alexandria, Virginia in 1785. The only problem was that Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry, didn't tell the Virginia delegates that there was going to be this conference between Maryland and Virginia. Washington caught wind of it. And what he did is he personally invited, to prevent this gathering from completely falling apart, invited him to Mount Vernon. And he also invited at least 2 of the delegates that Patrick Henry supposedly forgot to notify that they were commissioners, George Mason being one of them, and James Madison, another. And those 2 states resolved their problems in what became known as, I've got to work here, the Maryland-Virginia Compact of 1785, which was under the Articles of Confederation, Article 6, which reads, no 2 or more states shall enter into any treaty, confederation, or alliance whatsoever between them without the consent of the United States and Congress assembled. They did it anyway.
Oh.
And they removed all the restrictions, basically said that Virginians and Marylanders can navigate any part of the Chesapeake without being taxed or restricted, tariffed in any manner. So that led James Madison to the idea, well, these two states resolve a very serious problem. Let's call all the states together at Annapolis the next year and try and resolve similar economic differences with all the states. Well, unfortunately, in Annapolis, only 5 states showed up. And it wasn't enough to resolve anything. Now, not all states agreed to send commissioners, but at least 4 states that agreed to send commissioners didn't send them. And Rhode Island, for example, they were kind of obstinate about everything. So what this did, I call it just like they called Apollo 13 a successful failure. James Madison took it up and said, well, why don't we try meeting in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to resolve these issues. So the successful failure was that out of a failure of the Annapolis Convention came the success of the Constitutional Convention. One last thing, Shays' Rebellion. And this was problematic for everybody in the United States, all politicians, Washington included, because Massachusetts was the heart of the revolution. It was the beating heart of the American Revolution. If these guys are going off the deep end, we got serious trouble. And it turns out Daniel Shays never considered himself the leader of Shays' Rebellion. It was put down relatively easily, except that the state legislature in Boston had to pay for the army, appointed Benjamin Lincoln, who had done well at Saratoga, surrendered Charleston, South Carolina, with much ignominy added to that. Got lucky. Daniel Shays, for whatever reason, didn't take the federal arsenal in Massachusetts. He could have, should have. And so it was open for Benjamin Lincoln to get there, to get the artillery out. So if Daniel Shays had the artillery, he wins in January. But Benjamin Lincoln did a fast march, which was very unlike the 300-pound Lincoln doing anything, and got the artillery out. And there were 4 of the rebels that were killed, 20 were wounded. 4 of those were later convicted and executed. Daniel Shays managed to skedaddle to Vermont and later New York. And so Shays' Rebellion goes down in history as debt-ridden farmers shutting the courts down and rebelling against the United States. Yes, they were debt-ridden, but it wasn't not only the poor were involved in Shays' Rebellion, their wealthy neighbors were also involved in Shays' Rebellion. So that's something but it shook many of the politicians to the core and added to the incentive to begin to attend the Constitutional Convention in May of 1787 in Philadelphia. And Continental Congress even reluctantly approved the Philadelphia Convention in February 1787 for the sole and express purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation, which they almost immediately took off the table. So Philadelphia, May to September 1787, specifically September 17th, 1787, the first motion was to keep the proceedings secret. Not from a conspiratorial standpoint, but delegations were sent with instructions from their states on what they could talk about and what they couldn't talk about. And obviously, if they're talking about replacing the whole government, that was on the verboten list. So they agreed to keep the proceedings secret so that they could have genuine discussion, back and forth discussion, and put all ideas on the table. The second motion, that one vote on any issue would not be enough. It would have to be debated at least twice. And sometimes it was more than that because yes, no, yes, no, yes, a lot happened on specific issues. James Madison kept the most detailed notes. And technically he was forbidden from doing so. So at the convention, while it was in session, he could not take notes. So what he would do is go to a tavern every evening and sit down and from memory, write down everything that he could remember. And then he would check it out with other delegates. Did I get this right? Have I left anything out? And of course, those detailed notes would not be published until 1840, 4 years after Madison's death. And so they are the best source of information that we have. But he changed his mind on things. He edited them over the years. So the question, and he got some things wrong. So was his earlier memory the correct one? Or was his revision later in life the correct one? We don't know the answer to that. But it is the best source of what happened at the Constitutional Convention. And Madison was actually paranoid about keeping notes like that. And so one day Washington got up in the session, said somebody dropped their notes that they were taking. And I want the offending person to come up here and pick them up. Madison wrote, my hand was trembling. I put it in my pocket. Oh, they're there. It's not me. No one ever claimed one. Washington, of course, was unanimously elected the president of the Constitutional Convention. And what is clearly true is that had he not been chosen president, had he not even been present, the outcome of this convention had zero chance of being ratified. For most Americans, if it was good enough for Washington, Washington had proved himself already. He had stepped down. He could have been dictator at the end of the Revolutionary War. But instead, he gave his commission back to Congress and said, I have achieved the goal of us being able to create a republic. I hereby return my commission to you. George III of England said, if he can do that, he is the greatest man of his age. And both were true. He did do it. And now here he is, serving his nation once again as president of the Constitutional Convention. He only spoke at it one time, and that was towards the end when they were trying to limit the size of the American army to like 3,000 people. And Washington said, oh, hold on a second, I need to step down and talk as a representative. So he gets down and he says to them, here's the deal. If you can guarantee me that the offending invading army will only be no more than 3,000 people, I can go along with that. But they got the sarcasm, and that notion was quickly dropped. Benjamin Franklin is one of the key people there. He provided humor, practical wisdom, and he didn't think compromise was a dirty word. And that comes in especially critically early on in the convention. By the way, they shut all the windows of Independence Hall because there were people that wanted to get an early bird information. And so it was hot in there. And no air, they didn't have any fans to circulate air. So it was oppressive in Independence Hall during that time. Rhode Island, I used to tell my students, Rhode Island, sent no delegate. And it was, the Constitution was ratified and functioning for, I think, till 1792 before Rhode Island goes, whoopsies, we think we made a mistake. We'll ratify it. We want to join. And so, which said that because they weren't there, you automatically didn't have 13 states. You couldn't get unanimous approval to amend the articles. So scrap that idea. The delegates were wealthy and successful. The youngest was Jonathan Dayton from Delaware, I believe. I think if you look at your state quarters, I think your very first state quarter has Jonathan Dayton on the back of it riding a horse, because Maryland was the first, Delaware was the first to ratify, little Delaware state. The oldest was Benjamin Franklin at 81, and he was not in good health. Gout was a continuing and serious problem for him. Half were college graduates. Half were college graduates in 1780. That's saying something. On the other hand, over half were lawyers. And that's saying something too, both good and bad. 55 delegates attended at one time or another. 39 would sign and 16 would refuse, including George Mason, who wrote some of the critical language of the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson had copied, and Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, being notable examples. For them, the issue was no Bill of Rights. It's not that they didn't like the government, but they said that we needed to have a Bill of Rights. And of course, during the ratification process, as we will see, that's exactly the promise that the Federalists made. No more than 11 states were ever represented at one time. So never more than 11. So some have argued, aka Charles Beard, the famous economic political science writer, that the delegates were economic elites who worked to protect their own interests. A close examination of the discussions, that's where notes from Alexander Hamilton or from James Madison are very important, do not support that contention. Oops, let's back up. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, did not attend. I smell a rat in Philadelphia tending towards monarchy, were her exact words, but were the full phrase. And but neither did John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, because John Adams was our ambassador to England and Thomas Jefferson was our ambassador to France, where he had the famous affairs and where he probably got to know Sally Hemings really well. Wink, wink, nod, nod. Madison is often called the father of the Constitution, and this is fully justifiable. It is true that the major ideas and the general framework of the Constitution was from his mind. He was clearly the most learned political scientist of that time. He had spent 2 full years researching every government that existed that was in print that he had access to, learning what was successful and what led to each, the failure of each, and how many republics were, like the Republic of Venice, was not a republic at all. Most of them called themselves, the Republic of Poland was a monarchy. It wasn't. So he picked out the weaknesses of each of those governments, and he could say, well, do you remember the government on the Greek island of whatever it was called? And he knew that by heart and could answer people in the discussions on the floor. We talked about George Washington being president. Consensus, this is critical, that among these state delegations, there was consensus that a stronger government was needed. The question was, how much stronger was that government to be? And what amount of power the states would retain and how the states would treat each other. And also, I should say, and they also they had some agreement that Montesquieu was right, that the government needed to have 3 branches, executive, legislature, judicial. They basically agreed on that. And in fact, they cared so much about how Montesquieu was interpreted that the delegates would get in fistfights over, you're not interpreting Montesquieu correctly. Here is what Montesquieu meant. The guy would say, no, that's not true. Montesquieu meant the, not X. And so James Madison does a brilliant proactive strike. Very early on, he introduces the Virginia plan. And there is no other plan on the docket to be discussed. It's introduced by Edmund Randolph, and it became the basis for debate and revision. The essential elements survived to become our government. Not exactly, though. So a strong national legislature with 2 houses, both representative of states by population. A strong national executive appointed by the legislature. a national judiciary appointed by the legislature. So you can see that the large states would have commanded control of the legislature and therefore commanded control of the executive and the judicial branches. And that panicked the small states. The knee-jerk, I call it the knee-jerk reaction, was William Patterson's. So you would know he's from New Jersey because one of the big cities of New Jersey is Patterson, New Jersey, and it is named for William Patterson. They met in secret at night and put together the New Jersey plan. It would have kept Congress as it was under the Articles, in other words, a unicameral legislature, but given it the power to tax and regulate trade. There still would have been one vote for each state, weak executives, 2 or more, elected by Congress, which was controlled by the small states because there were more small states than there were large states. A weak national judiciary appointed by the executive, who were controlled by Congress, who was controlled by the small states. And essentially, it simply amended the Articles. States keep the most power. The Connecticut or Great Compromise. I remember somebody had asked in the last session about who was Roger Sherman. Well, he is the one that had signed the only signer of all 4 of the major pieces of governmental legislation. And he proposed, and his compromise was actually proposed early on, but rejected until basically the convention fell apart and they agreed to take some time off. And of course, reporters being outside, Washington came out with a very dour glare, very disgusted, and they say, things are falling apart because we saw Washington and he looks very unhappy. But thanks to Benjamin Franklin, who said, okay, he gathered together some delegates from Virginia. He gathered together some delegates from small state delegates and said, look, can't we compromise? Isn't there a workable compromise here? And of course, Roger Sherman said, well, I think I've got one here. So the House of Representatives would be based upon state population and directly elected by the people. At this time, the issue of whether to count purposes of the slaves or purposes of representation was left unresolved. In the Senate, this was the part that appealed to the small states. There would be 2 senators from each state. And let's keep in mind, one of the things that the Senate couldn't do, which made the large states feel more comfortable, was no fiscal bills could start in the Senate. They all had to start in the lower house, directly elected by the people. Initially, and many of you know this, senators were not directly elected by the people because the thinking of the framers was that the representatives of the people through their state legislatures would be the very best way to get the very best people into the Senate. Now, obviously, over time, it came smoke-filled back rooms and deals and bargains. And it wasn't until the 16th Amendment, I think it is, I'll have to look, that the the senators from each state were directly elected. And some political scientists claim essentially what that did was make the Senate a smaller House of Representatives. And rather than having enduring wisdom, their votes would shift depending upon the will of the people, and they would lose the stability that they had hoped that the Senate was designed to have. And I think there is something to that argument. The treatment of slavery, and the bottom line is very clear. If they didn't find a compromise, if they tried to ban slavery, and there weren't all that many Northerners at that time that were along the Emancipation Highway. So, and it was quite clear that South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia would walk if slavery wasn't allowed to persist. So they recognized that they, again, compromised. They came up with what's known as the 3/5 compromise. So since the issue of slavery was not resolvable at that time, you will notice that you can, even in the original Constitution, if you could find one that hasn't been, where the issue of slavery hasn't been edited out, the word slave was never used. They were called property. And so the question is, was the Constitution a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery document? Interestingly enough, the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison says it was a deal made in hell and burned it publicly, claiming it was, claiming that it encouraged slavery and not only permitted slavery. On the other hand, Frederick Douglass, so William Lloyd Garrison's a white guy, Frederick Douglass is an ex-slave and a black guy. He says no, and William Lloyd Garrison at one point was Frederick Douglass's mentor, but that ended over time. Frederick Douglass said, no, you've got it wrong. They were too ashamed to use the word slave in the Constitution, and therefore it is an anti-slavery document. So the compromise they came up with had two parts, that each slave counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation, and that the states would have, the southern states, the slave states, would have the right to go into the northern states and recapture their escaped slaves, which was an anathema to many Northerners. Even if they didn't really care one way or another, about slavery itself, they did care deeply about the interference of the slave catchers. Because what the slave catchers would do is, it's kind of like the immigration roundup right now. They didn't care whether they were free or not. They were property worth several $1,000s at that time. And think about what several $1,000s in that time means in today's money. It was a huge amount of money. They didn't care. They captured them, and even if they were free and weren't runaways, they just took them back into slavery. And that deeply upset Northerners. And that would be an issue that would come back in the 1850 Compromise, when the federal government, by the 1850 Compromise, was required to assist the slave catchers. And that deeply offended many, and there were battles and shootings and sometimes near revolutions as slave catchers, in Boston, Massachusetts, really, but they did. And knowing what the people knowing what the outcome was. And then the last piece of it was that the international slave trade was forbidden until the year 1808. And I saw a document once that meant that at least 750,000 more Africans were brought into slave during that time period. They initially tried to get the end as 1800, change of a new millennium. No, that was not acceptable. So no tax was allowed on exports. That cotton and tobacco were our major exports. That favored the South. And by the way, the 3/5 Amendment effectively gave control of the American government to the South until the election of 1860. Because of all the presidents between Washington and Abraham Lincoln, only John Adams and John Quincy Adams didn't own slaves. So, and then they controlled who was nominated to the Supreme Court, and you can see how that worked out. The end result, as I said, now wrapping up. So July 27th and August 6th break. So we have two committees that become very critically important. The first one is the Committee of Style or Detail, headed by John Rutledge. John Rutledge from South Carolina basically hijacked the Constitution in the rewriting, because he provided an initial outline, which James Wilson from Pennsylvania polished. Provisions were added that were never discussed at the Constitutional Convention, and others were borrowed from the Articles of Confederation, also not without any voting approval of any committee. The Committee of Style, then headed by Gouverneur Morris, a lot of people pronounce it governor, that's not the way you pronounce that. He has the name Gouverneur because that was his mother's surname. She was Sarah Gouverneur. And there were going to be no descendants of Sarah Gouverneur with the last name Gouverneur, so she made Gouverneur Morris's first name her last name. They revised and effectively rewrote the product of the convention from September 8th to 12th, and the changes made were significant. And to the point that scholars of the Constitution argue whether a period was intended here or a comma was intended, because a comma connects the power with whatever is previous to the power, whereas a period stops it and means that maybe this power does not necessarily go with what we have been talking about in the past. So signing the document, Benjamin Franklin, which I read to you the first session, his final attempt to convince the holdouts to sign, they didn't, but it was still a brilliant talk and worth remembering. Now, the struggle to ratify meant you needed 9 states, technically illegal. Keep in mind, this whole process of the Constitutional Convention was technically illegal because it wasn't unanimous. They only needed, still, 9 was 69%, that's pretty good, but only 9 states had to ratify for it to become effective. But the reality was this: if the 9 states didn't include New York, Massachusetts, Virginia, it wasn't going to work. So you could have had a constitution go into effect, but the effect was a government that it didn't represent a majority of the people in the country. So Rhode Island, we pointed that out before, held out until after Washington's inauguration. And the country divided into the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, as deeply as the disagreements that we are seeing today, just FYI. Anti-Federalists hated Federalists, Federalists hated Anti-Federalists. And effectively, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who were allied at that point, geniuses in their own right, stole a march on the people opposed to the Constitution. Because the term Federalist in 1787 meant people in favor of states' rights. That was the opposite. So they called themselves Federalists. And I hear the people that are saying, wait a minute, what do we call ourselves? So they called themselves the Anti-Federalists, which in effect meant they were opposed to what they really were for. So that was brilliant. And so 85 Federalist papers were written, and about 50 by Alexander Hamilton, 30 by James Madison, and exactly five by John Jay. We know John Jay was Alexander Hamilton's original partner in writing the Federalist Papers. But after he wrote 5, he got ill. And so then Hamilton had to cast about for another author to join him in writing these papers. And James Madison, the author of the Virginia Plan, was the clear and essential candidate. Federalists were popular with merchants and city dwellers. Strong government would protect us from foreign powers and solve internal problems like trade. And they realized the greatest complaint of the Anti-Federalists was that there wasn't a Bill of Rights. So Madison said, the first thing that we're going to do when Congress starts up is take up a Bill of Rights. And then he reneges on that promise. He does not take it up first. Anti-Federalists were popular with farmers and laborers. They claimed the convention was not legal, correct. They believed the convention was a power grab from the states, correct. No Bill of Rights, correct. The gains of the revolution were at stake. So Hamilton, we talked about the 80 essays, and I pointed out earlier that, and this is one of the pieces where I was asked, did they favor the Greeks and the Romans? Did they favor the Greeks over the Romans in their political thinking? And I answered it was Romans that clearly were who the founders favored and whose thinking was critically important. So much so that all of the Federalist Papers were written under the name, the author was Publius Publicola, a long dead Roman. And all of the people of that time knew who Publius Publicola was, although when I mention it here, none of you will likely know who Publius Publicola was. But he was the great, he introduced the law to Rome and then stayed and applied it. Unlike Solon of Greek, who introduced the laws to Greek and then went on a long vacation. So they greatly preferred Publius Publicola. And in fact, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison wrote so clearly as Publius Publicola that in at least 5 of the Federalists, we have no idea who the author was. Could have been Hamilton, could have been Madison. No way you dissect them can you, whether it's the length of the sentence, the words used in the sentence, the punctuation, in no aspect of assessing it can you determine whether it was Madison or Hamilton. So the Anti-Federalists were not nearly as, they were disorganized, eloquent sometimes, but they didn't want to be left out of the new union. So you had that going for them too. So in 3 states, Massachusetts, the critical area of the states of ratification were Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. It was ratified first in Massachusetts, very narrowly. In Virginia was second, and had it not been for those counties in what later became West Virginia, it was the Western anti-elitists, people, mostly Scotch-Irish, that provided the winning votes in Virginia, the Western counties did. In New York, it was by 1 vote. And we know who that vote was. He was a gentleman by the name of Melancton Smith, who railed against the Constitution, railed against ratifying it, and finally said, what happens if we get left out? And switched his vote and provided the winning vote for ratification in the state of New York. So we are to be a union. Now, that said, I did mention down here at the bottom, the fugitive slave clause was the most bitter pill for the North to take, as was the delay of international slave trade. Now, I naively thought that when it became illegal to have international slave trade, that was the end of it. I should have realized, no way. The international slave trade continued right up through the Civil War. So and the only slave captain that was ever punished was by Abraham Lincoln. And that captain was hung. He's the only captain engaging in illegal international slave trade that was ever hung. And it was Lincoln said, I'm sorry, he knew better. I cannot, if I free him, what message am I sending to my people? What message am I sending to the African-American population? It's a no in all cases. I am not going to parole him. And so he got hung. So that's about it for the essential part, and I will open it up to anybody with questions and respond to them to the best of my ability. Yes, sir. What's your first name, please?
John.
John.
The Federalist Papers were printed in newspapers of the day.
Yes.
And so they were read by influencers and that.
Of that time period. That's exactly right. And then later they were combined and published in 2 volumes. And you can get a Barnes and Noble version. It's like 700 pages. I mean, these are long and critically important ways of understanding how the founding fathers intended our government ought to work. Let me grab it. So the Federalist, and let me grab from Federalist, I think it's 39, no, 51. Now, these guys understood human nature. He said, but the great security, again, and this is a James Madison. We know for sure this was James Madison. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the same several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. The provision for defense must be in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself? But the greatest of all reflections on human nature. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and the next place oblige it to control itself. And so human nature matters, and they understood human nature very well. Yes. Yes. Generally speaking, it's hard. Hamilton was a brilliant man. I don't know that he had a map in his mind about the order in which things should be talked about. At times when I read them, it seems a little bit scattered. And you will find a talk about the judicial department is Federalist 78. So way towards the end. So obviously, Hamilton, who wrote that particular one, didn't think the judicial department, the Supreme Court, was as critically as important as it ultimately turned out to be. But he did say this, because nowhere in the Constitution is the Supreme Court given the power to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. They just made it up. That's the best way. The case is Marbury versus Madison. Yes, the same James Madison, who was then Secretary of State, but that's when the court, and rather logically, because he basically, Hamilton does address, if not the court in Federal 78, who else would have the authority to be able to rule on the laws? So John Marshall actually used that idea. That's where he got the idea, because he read the Federalist and then charted a very narrow decision. And because John Adams had stacked the appointments before he left office, and then James Madison of the next administration, which was Republican, was obligated to deliver them. And James Madison ain't delivering these. And so Marbury had been given, it was like a justice of the peace. It wasn't any great shakes, but the court ruled, yes, you are entitled to that position of justice of the peace. However, the law which grants you that authority is clearly unconstitutional. Jefferson was beyond angry that Marshall had outsmarted him, because Jefferson said, I don't care which way you rule, I'm going to win on this one. And he didn't. So Marshall was clearly aware of Federalist 78 on what the court could do, what it probably should do, but you don't find that right anywhere in the United States Constitution. This is a personal peak of my own. Every time somebody announces, well, there's John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. No, he's not. He is the Chief Justice of the United States. End of discussion, period. Point on that. Yes,
I have read that the Iroquois Confederacy, the principles had some kind of effect on the founding fathers and how they.
they certainly knew about it. They were aware of it. But you have to be careful about it. They didn't care too much about indigenous peoples. So what kind of weight they gave it, Mattis clearly knew about it. And so you have how they treated each other certainly affected their thinking. Yes, sir.
So I didn't realize until now that they outlawed the slave trade.
Yes. 1800, actually, they outlawed it in 1807 to go into effect in 18. So the moment that Congress had the authority to do it, they did it and implemented it in 1808.
But you said though they continued it, but did people in the North find out? And was this?
I don't know how much common knowledge that was, but it's very clear. There have been a number of books on that subject that have just been published recently, and it's very clear that the Southerners knew what was going on. And I can't believe the bottom line is the North benefited monetarily from the cotton that was produced in the South. Not only did it give the government income, it also provided cotton for the great mills in New England. So yeah, and so you find you would think New England is a hotbed of abolitionism. It kind of was, but there were lots of people. The city of New York thought about seceding from the state of New York and joining the Confederacy.
Well, because the mayor at the time of the Civil War
Yes.
was for the Confederacy.
Yes. Yeah. Was it Fernando Wood, I think, is his name? I can't remember it, but I think that's it. Yes, he was clearly pro-South. And Washington, D.C., the capital, was clearly pro-South. That was a real issue, which is why Abraham Lincoln did revoke the right of habeas corpus, which does not do what Kristi Noem said it does, gives the president the authority to take people out of the country. No, it doesn't. But Lincoln did revoke initially along the railroads through Maryland to prevent Maryland from cutting off troops from getting to the capital to defend it. Yes, Bill. It's Bill, right?
Yes, Preston, nice job. Question is that it's we call ourselves Homo sapiens, which means we're more wise, but the history book does not support the second statement because we don't seem to learn. And the question is, how is it that they didn't foresee a psychotic sociopath getting a job and then
Lincoln did, but that's much later down the road. I think they actually did worry about psychotic sociopaths, but they were hoping that was one of the purposes of the Electoral College, was that wise people would vote for wise people. And that did not turn out to be the case. And in fact, as we will see in the next session, the original Constitution did not differentiate an electoral vote for the president from an electoral vote for the vice president. So in the election of 1800, both Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson got the same number of electoral votes. But Aaron Burr wasn't officially running for president, but the Constitution did not make that distinction. And so it went to a lot of votes in Congress, and finally Alexander Hamilton, through his weight behind Thomas Jefferson, whom he thoroughly hated, and with some justification, and he was the vote that turned the tables and broke the tie in Congress and elected Thomas Jefferson. Yes. Questions? All questions are fair game. Yes.
I'm interested in your initial comments coming into this discussion tonight about, the statesmen, half of them being lawyers, and then we all laughed.
More than half being
Yeah,
lawyers.
another lawyer joke. But why did you say it? Why was it pejorative even back then?
I'm not sure it was pejorative back then. I'm using present-mindedness to do that because I know people will react to thinking about lawyers. The fact is, lawyers tended to be highly educated, so there's
They knew the law.
yeah, they knew the law and they had been trained in the law, and in many cases, like Abraham Lincoln did not go to college or school to learn the law. These guys, most of them, that the same half that were college educated probably made up the bulk of the lawyers as well.
I would think so.
I would think so too.
Public disclosure and lawyers with consciences couldn't run for government.
Yeah.
So we didn't have any, we had fewer statesmen now because we made a law that said you have to disclose your income, and conscionable lawyers won't disclose their plans.
Good point. But yeah, so, having worked with a couple of lawyers on our school's mock trial team, I have deep respect for a good lawyer. Deep respect for a principled good lawyer. And I also admit that there are a lot of ambulance chasers in this world too. Sad but true.
Excuse me, Dr. Peet.
Yes.
We're getting comments in the chat that it's very difficult to hear the people asking questions. So if you could repeat the question, we can hear you fine, but we're missing much of what is being asked of you.
I will happily do that. Fact is, I can take the microphone to them so you can hear clearly. So, Rich.
Good job this evening. So I'm going to presume that your T-shirt is reflecting Harry Reid, Senator from Nevada, or is this someone else?
Actually, it's someone else. This was a competition. It does look like him. This was a guy, a political scientist by the name of James Q. Wilson. And James Q. Wilson was the author of our textbook. And early on in my teaching career, he was very conservative. I was very liberal, but he wrote an excellent textbook that's
Tom, you need to come back over here
Oh,
for that.
that just puts right down the middle. And so every time a student would mention James Q. Wilson, I'd start saying, you got to put your hand over your heart when you say the words James Q. Wilson. And so this is James Q. Wilson. Then I started in 2008 a House Cup competition. And I had either 3 or 4 classes throughout the time. And each class could choose to be Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, or Slytherin. And so they would have a year-long competition. So that's why the back of my shirt. So my 3rd period class, that's why the heart has a 3 in it here. My 3rd period class knew that I loved them being creative and that they would get bonus points for being very creative. So they created a class set of T-shirts. For me, this is the 2nd time I've worn it since I got it in 2011, and it hung in my closet until today. And I thought, this is good for letting you know the esprit de corps that can develop in high school classes with great kids. Yes.
So my question is, when did the Federalists become the Federalists that we know today?
Oh,
What year or approximate period?
Tom, repeat the question. Repeat the question.
what year did the Federalists become the You're thinking of the Federalist Society that exists today. Yeah. I don't know how well that Federalist Society really represents the values of the Federalists themselves. I don't think it does. But they claim that it does.
So, but earlier you were talking about Federalists represented people, and the anti-Federalists.
No, the anti-Federalists were the farmers and the and rural, and the businessmen were the big business of that time were the Federalists, yeah, and big business and strong government to protect their interests. Yes, sir.
Joe, by the way, I agree. Today's climates upon the position that our forefathers didn't foresee parties being a problem as they have become and are divisiveness along party lines. Do you think that was also not foreseen?
No, so I hope you heard the question. The question was, did the people of that time understand political parties and the danger of political parties? If you look at, it might be Federalist, I think it's Federalist 10, but Federalist 10 deals with factions. And that was the name that is interchangeable with political parties. And Madison feared factions and tried to do everything possible. And George Washington did not consider himself to be a member of a political party. He did not consider himself a Federalist. He aligned with their views, but he did not consider himself. He taught political parties, and he also talked in his farewell address about the danger of factions, that it had the potential to tear the country apart. And that was that's why, and Hamilton was his ghostwriter, but it was Washington. Washington said, "This is what I want to say." And he personally checked every single word in that farewell address to make sure that it aligned with his own beliefs.
Okay, then, did they put things in place to check that? And the real, where the rubber meets the road?
Long story short, yes. But it had to do with the fact that you had individual states, individual boundaries. The thinking was they would have no way to concentrate a majority faction in that particular time. But of course, they didn't think about television. They didn't think about radio, didn't think about internet, all sorts of things that they couldn't anticipate. And initially, you got to keep in mind the newspapers of that time up through the 1870s or 1880s were political organs. If it was the Springfield Journal, it was Democratic, but then the Sangamo Journal, which was Republican. So almost every city had at least 2 newspapers. Some had 4, 5, and 6, but all of them were aligned with. They were the spokespersons for a political party. So if you think some of the nasty stuff you see now and here, it was the same thing, but in newspapers.
Yeah. I grew up in a small city in western New York called Jamestown, and I'm going to be 77 in September, but I recall clearly that there were 2 newspapers in town. One was distinctly Republican and one was distinctly Democrat. And the viewpoints were obvious. I mean, it wasn't just on the editorial page, it was throughout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They made no pretense of being objective.
No.
And Lincoln surreptitiously sent hundreds of articles to newspapers in the state of Illinois that he didn't sign as the author to influence political thinking.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Can you guys hear me through the TV?
Yes, I can.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for putting this on.
Yeah, I can hear you. So you're like,
Okay. My question was, okay, so right now we have a situation, a bit of a standoff between the Supreme Court and the president over the interpretation of his Article 2 powers. And
I wish there was such a standoff.
Okay, so you think they're rolling over. So my question to you was like, what is the game they're playing? Like sometimes they're standing up to him with like the 9-0 ruling about Kilmar, but then also, you know, sometimes they're kind of rolling over. So like, are they trying to seem like they're checking without outright obstructing so he can't just say, "Oh, the court hates me," or what's going on there?
I think you're
The question.
Oh, the question is, what is the Supreme Court doing presently? Because it seems like they're schizophrenic. Sometimes, like the 9-0 decision that Kilmar Abrego Garcia had to be returned, that Trump ignored and then finally obeyed, versus the real danger, as in such as giving him immunity for almost all his acts as the president of the United States, which I think was a misreading. Nowhere is that in the Constitution. So I think the conservative members of the court are just throwing a bone every now and then to their 3 justices who are left of center, and not really paying a lot of attention to the Constitution. That's my personal opinion.
Well, that's sad,
Anybody else
but I appreciate
online?
your honesty.
Go ahead.
I said that's really sad, but I appreciate your honesty.
Well, keep in mind, I fully admit to being a Democrat and have been proud of that my whole life. So my parents were Republicans, and I think they often thought, where did they go wrong? At least my dad probably did. But I can't remember the first presidential election. I remember I watched the Kennedy-Nixon debates. I was a 10-year-old and I watched them on TV. And I loved John Kennedy. And so it was quite a disappointment to ultimately find out how morally flawed John Kennedy was. But that doesn't take away from his intellectual brilliance. He had great potential. Any other questions online? Any other questions live and not online? Rich?
One quick one. So Article 1 gives power and responsibility, yes, to Congress to provide oversight and control when the executive branch is not upholding the rule of law and abiding by the Constitution. Other than our voting opportunity and our responsibility to vote, what else is it at this time?
At this time, what else there is for us to stand up at every reasonable opportunity and make ourselves visible and heard, and let those that say opposite. We love America. We love America more than some people who claim to be patriots love America. And let's make the flag, instead of me being embarrassed to see a truck go by with an American flag flying behind it, because I know that's exactly what political position that person has, and being embarrassed by that, I would certainly like to take pride in our flag and what it represents in the best of all worlds, that shining city on the hill that Governor Winthrop first talked about and Reagan echoed hundreds of years later. Yes, Bill.
Oh, I was just going to comment that the Democratic Party's entry into the 2 parades, Forks and Port Angeles, was resplendent with flags. I forget how many we had. I don't know, it must have been 25 flags on this thing.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I was depressed on July the 4th.
Yeah.
And I freely admit it. I'm not hopeless, but I was depressed.
And at the No Kings protest, many flags
Yes,
and many veterans.
right. And hundreds of people in cars honked in support of that, which was great for Port Angeles. The Dodge Ram truck drivers seem to have an issue, but other than that, and I don't mean to discriminate against Dodge Ram truck drivers.
Okay, Tom, letters or phone calls, what are the most effective?
Phone calls to your representative, and probably to a lot of Republicans that aren't your representatives. You have the right to call them too. Bill.
Members in the party have a tremendous number of members that are in the party in various states, various locations, because when the polls see that they've got X number of members, they know that those people are going to vote. And that person could have only donated 10, but So you must, like here, it costs $20 for party membership. And sometimes, you know, if you come to a certain thing, we'll get here for free. And that's a real, reading that has tremendous impact.
Yeah, we are lucky. We've got a very good representative here, even though she was a freshman this year, blindsided by the nonsense that's going on. And to reflect back to what Rich said, the Constitution gives an obligation to Congress for oversight. That's one thing that I don't think the framers could have anticipated was the nature of a cult. Under normal circumstances, almost nothing that Trump has done would have been contested verbally, loudly, and now if there are death threats made to the representatives who stand up against him, and even those that don't get death threats, just because that seems to be the nature of the environment that we live in today.
Moved on this couple of weeks ago, not just death threats, but killing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Anything else for the good of the cause? For everybody here, thank you so much.
And tell them when the next one is.
And online, and the next session will be August the 7th, which is a Thursday, here in the Raymond Carver Room of Port Angeles Library System at 6 p.m. till whenever all questions are asked and answered.
Yeah.